Okay, for our last breakout session, we're going to talk about getting started, managing change in a bottom-up implementation. So we talked a little bit about how you identify assessment controls in the first breakout session. Then we talked about the failure points and the reason that you would want to do something that is knowledge aware in the second breakout session. So once we know we want to do it, once we identify where those assessments are, where the knowledge packets are, the most difficult thing that we ever have to do is actually managing the change itself. So there are a lot of different things that we can do, and there are a lot of different ways that we try to help manage that change, and we'll talk a little bit about what those things are. So we're going to talk about a roadmap. So what does a roadmap for implementation of a software like Auros look like? What are some of the common challenges with implementing that software? And then what are the best practices that we can use to help deal with some of those challenges that we may face as we're trying to go through this process of implementation. And we have a stepped process that we'll talk about conceptually, and at the end of these activities there's a deliverable, and that deliverable can be used in a couple of different ways, and we'll talk about what those deliverables are, why they exist, stuff like that. So we're going to switch over to the actual roadmap. We'll give an overview of what that is. So similar to what Jeff showed in the introduction, this is a map that shows you the different steps that are incorporated in doing an implementation like this. So there's stuff that happens before an organization decides that they want to implement something that's knowledge aware, something like Auros. Then there are things that happen once they make that decision. How do we help manage the change within the organization and the culture? So the first thing that we're going to do is what we call a briefing. So that briefing is going to be where our knowledge-aware consultants come out and they start to educate the organization. The knowledge-aware approach is very different from the way that documents are used to manage knowledge. So we need to start to educate people on how to change the way they think about doing this and get some buy-in. We want to make sure that people understand what we're talking about, how we're going to do this stuff. And the briefing is designed to do that. So we come in, the presentation, or at least something similar to what Jeff gave in the beginning, is what we'll start to use, and we'll start to communicate this thing to people within an organization. And what we're going to do with this, and the reason we do it, is we want to start to get the interest of influential stakeholders. So at the end of the briefing, we do this multiple times. Sometimes we'll come in and we'll do it with management. We'll then do it with the working groups. We'll do it with middle management. And the whole goal of this is to start to promote the concept, promote that there is a better way to manage knowledge, and that we can actually do it, and we can ensure the use of it. We can build trust for users in these processes and in these systems. And that's what we want to start to do, and we want to start to communicate to organizations. So at the end of the briefing, we have buy-in from the influential stakeholders, or the people who are making decisions, or the people who are going to have to use the system, that this is a concept that we want to adopt, and it's something that we want to undertake within our organization. So this happens a lot of times in the sales process. Well, actually all the time in the sales process. But then even after we sell, we have additional things as we start to develop other workflows and we go to other departments where we'll continue to do this kind of a briefing exercise because we want to promote the concepts within the organization. So after the briefing, and people start to buy in, they say, yeah, we want to do this. The next question that we get is, well, where do we start? Right? This is a huge elephant. So how do you actually eat the elephant? Well, we have to start small. So we say Auros is a bottom-up organic system. So the second thing that we'll do is we want to scope out a project. So we do this with our knowledge-aware consultants. They come in and they start to understand the information that's being used, the processes that you have within your organization, and we'll start to scope that project out. So once we decide that we want to do this, a lot of times it has to be communicated, upstream to your boss, maybe downstream to the people that work for you, or in parallel, or to people that are your peers. Because doing something like this is an enterprise implementation, and it's not something that just happens within a silo or within a group. If it does, then you don't actually get the benefit out of the system that we believe it can provide. So when we go to the scoping session, we'll start to understand what it is you do, understand the places that Auros can be used to help your organization, and at the end of that, we actually produce a physical charter, and that physical charter is used as a communication piece. So when you go and talk to management and you tell them this is something we should do, that scoping session is going to produce a charter that you can use and see this is what we're going to start with. This is how we're going to do the project. This is the timing. These are the people involved. And it's a communication piece that we found has been valuable for people as they're trying to get buy-in from different people in the organization in order to do something like this. So when we finish doing the scoping session, the next thing that we do is the seed project, right? So there's some people here who have maybe done seed projects. I know Kim is involved in a seed project right now. Anthony has been in the past. He's doing some other ones at his organization. So the seed project is designed to come in and actually start to put a production workflow in place. So we want to understand the process that's been scoped in the scoping session. We want to then start to educate the people within the organization on Auros. How can it be used to actually accomplish the things that you're trying to accomplish? And that seed project is going to be 15 weeks generally. And what we want to do at the end of it, the deliverables for the seed project are going to be a production-ready footprint. So there are a lot of different ways that we can define what a production-ready footprint is. And we have some things that we think are valuable and things that will happen after the seed project once you have a production-ready footprint. But in addition to that, we want to have a production rollout plan. So not only do we want the system to be ready to be used on production projects, but we want to have a plan of how are we actually going to get people to use it on those projects. And then in addition to that, we're going to be communicating to more people. We're going to be introducing more people to the technology, how it works, what value it can bring. So we start to get organizational buy-in, not just from a conceptual level, people start to actually see the way that the software can be used. So this seed project is an interaction that we go through where we learn a lot about our customers learn a lot about the software, and we start to merge those two things together into how can we actually achieve these things that are knowledge aware, how can we actually provide value and see value from this particular concept and implementing it. So I think now we have a polling question. I actually think I skipped the polling question earlier. So we have maybe 2 polling questions. So we can skip over to those. If you guys open up your app. So this question is, rate your level of collaboration across your organization. So all functions and groups collaborate together. We have most functions collaborate together, or some functions do, or no functions collaborate together. So we've talked a little bit about the challenges that we'll face as we're trying to convince people to do something like this. But the biggest challenge that we actually face is the culture change. So once people say, yes, we want to do this, that's really the easy part for us. It's not easy, but it's the easy part compared to changing the actual culture of an organization, changing the way that knowledge is captured, shared, and reused. So if we go back from the polling question, so here we see some functional groups collaborate together is pretty common. Most of the time we see people that operate in silos. It's very difficult for one group to communicate to the other group. There's a theory that we've heard talked about, which is the theory of sub-optimization, right? So if the theory is, in order for the organization to be optimized, all the individual parts within the organization have to be sub-optimized. Because if it's the best thing for this group, but it really damages the communication to the group over here, then it's not best for the entire organization, right? So the individual groups have to be sub-optimized in order for the organization to be optimized. So as we start to implement Auros, we'll start to understand the ways that one group works and the way that another group works. We've got this organizational buy-in from the seed project, but how do we actually manage the change of that? So what we've found is that by starting small, by showing value and proving out the ways that the software can provide that value, that's how we'll start to manage the change. So we finish the seed project and we start to put a production plan together. Instead of putting together work instructions and rolling out to everyone in the organization, if we pick a project, we're going to pilot on that individual project in production, and we select different people within the organization that we know are open-minded, they're open to change. It'll help us start to provide that value and build a case for you can trust this system. It's not going to be out of date. It's not going to lack relevance to you because it's specifically delivering you the information when and where you need it. So we finish the seed project and we start to then push this thing out in small batches. Once we get one production project that's been running it, we start to gain more organizational buy-in, and then we can start to expand to additional production projects. As that's happening, a lot of times what we'll see, and this is probably similar to things that happen in your organization, there's a lot of talking between people, talking between groups, and that talking, unfortunately, right, is not about the lessons that you learned, but it's more about the systems that you have and how they do or do not work. So as we can start to see implementations and we can put things in production that people actually get value from, we see those things start to get communicated almost organically by the individuals that are using it to the people that are not. As a product of the seed project that we didn't talk about is we'll start to identify additional processes. So as people are being communicated to that, this is something that's beneficial for us, it's something that we can actually use, and it's going to be different from our traditional document management approach, we'll start to put together a roadmap for where the next process is that we're going to go. What are we going to do from an adjacency perspective? So once the seed project's complete, we have this production rollout plan, we start rolling it out, then we start to get organizational buy-in, we start to have actual production usage where we can point to these things and say, here's where we solved some problems, here's where we prevented a past mistake. That stuff all starts to get communicated through word of mouth, and we start to develop additional processes. So an adjacency development is going to be additional seed projects. So when we run those internally, we'll run multiple seed projects in parallel. One production footprint has been rolled out. We've got word of mouth. People are starting to communicate about the positive aspects of a system. But as that's happening, we're also starting to develop or plant more seeds in adjacent areas. So when we get through the adjacency development, what the deliverable for that will be is something that we call critical mass. So there's not a whole lot of rocket science conceptually that goes into changing the culture, but the actual way that information is pushed out to people, that it's communicated, oftentimes is delicate. It's easy to talk about conceptually, but to implement, it's very delicate, and we have to make sure that we set it up in ways that we make sure we provide value to people and we show them what value can be provided and how it can be provided. So as we're going through the adjacency development, we start to gain more organizational interest. People start to see the value. It's now becoming real. There's actually production footprint. People have things that they can point to, real life examples of things that have been prevented or things that were solved because they're using the knowledge-aware approach. And then because of those things, the organizational buy-in is increasing across the group. It's increasing across functions, across domains within the organization. So we'll start small, we plant the seed, we want to roll it into production small, we want to make sure we test it, we do it in a smart way. Then we expand into other groups. We can expand across global functions or across global organizations. And that's one seed project. These adjacent developments are multiple seed projects within an organization. So we start to get organizational buy-in, we start to get people using the software, promoting that it's beneficial, promoting that it can promote, promoting that it can point to end user trust, that people do start to think that there's a way to capture knowledge and that it's not just a box that needs to be checked in a checklist that you did your lessons learned, but they actually see the value that's provided from it. So at the end of our adjacent development, like I said, critical mass, we're going to have multiple production-ready processes. We'll have multiple processes that are potentially rolled out to production. And that value that we're talking about from a conceptual level is now starting to be realized from the organization. So people are actually seeing it happen, and we're not just talking about how it can happen, which increases the organizational buy-in. So ultimately, what do we want to have happen? During seed project, during adjacent development, we're doing a lot of what's happening right now where we're selling the concept. We're selling the idea that this can actually happen. Well, once people start to see it happen, they start to participate in seed projects. They see the way that the concepts can be applied to what they're doing. They see the way that it can be rolled out. They see that it can be positive. Then we start to do more seed projects. That continues to grow. This idea of organic growth is something that we've seen happen in a lot of different organizations. Adjacent developments, though, we're still selling the concept. We're still communicating to people, and we're pushing this development and this implementation. Over time, and what we've seen at some of our bigger organizations, we have some people that are in the other room that can talk to you about this. is that we actually don't have to go out and sell anymore. People are coming to us. They're actually asking to do this kind of a thing without us having to go out and conceptually tell them that it works, because they've seen it work. They've seen organizations or functions within their organization actually take advantage of the technology. So the demand-driven growth is something that makes it a lot easier for the sales guys and a lot easier for the technicians that are maybe in the IT department or for the application engineering team, because people are coming to us and asking if they can start to use Auros. We don't have to communicate that the concept is better and that it's beneficial for them. So that demand-driven growth, the product of that demand-driven growth, and the deliverable or the thing that we get as demand-driven growth continues is this enterprise capability. So the demand-driven growth produces production footprints across the enterprise, across multiple functions, across the pond potentially if you're a global organization. And then as this enterprise capability gets produced, you have continuous learning as a product of it. So people know that if they send an email, it's going to get responded to. In our situation, people know if they author a knowledge packet, it's going to get into a process, it's going to be evaluated, it's going to provide value for individuals. So this enterprise capability becomes part of the fabric of the company. It becomes actually the things that people do and they take for granted because it's just the way that business operates. And knowledge aware then becomes the norm, right? It's now something like email that's just done. It's not a box at the end of a process that people participate in just because they have to. It's something that actually they see happen and it's just second nature and it's a part of their everyday life. So that's a lot of stuff. It's a lot of information to kind of take in in a small period of time. And it's not necessarily easy, right? The culture change that we deal with and convincing people or showing value for organizations and for individuals that this is a real concept, it's an actual thing that can be accomplished, is a very difficult thing to do, and it's the hardest thing that we deal with. The technology, I always say, is the easiest part of what we do, right? Putting things in place so that people can actually evaluate them is an easy part. Convincing people to trust it, convincing people that it works, and convincing people that it is worth their time is the hard part about this. So if we do our seed projects and we do them in a way that sets the organization up so that they can grow into the functionalities that we know are available and the technology that we know is available, this model-based world and all these things, it's going to help us to convince them that it's done well. So a lot of times we'll have our application engineers come in and we get an Excel file, or we get a PDF, or we get a Word document from customers. And the first thing that we'll try to do is take that document and turn it into Auros. And what we found over time, because we use Auros to actually run our implementations, is that the problems that we were having is because we're taking the document and we're turning it into Auros. What we really need to understand is, why does the document exist? What are people actually trying to accomplish with the Excel file? What are they actually trying to accomplish with the checklist or with the calculation sheet? Once we understand that, we can understand, okay, well, this is what that looks like in Auros. It may not look exactly like the checklist. It may not look exactly like the calculation sheet. This is what it looks like long term. And then our job, or people that are at their organizations who are tasked with implementing something like this, their job is to take what's done today, what that looks like in Auros, and then merge the two together. Because the culture change, if we just configure what it looks like ultimately in Auros, and it's completely different from the Excel file that people use today, we know from experience that people are going to push back, they're going to resist. They're not going to buy into what we're saying because it's still a concept to them. It's something that they look at, it's complicated, and we're not sure how to do it. So the challenge here is understanding what's actually trying to be accomplished, figuring out or envisioning what that looks like in Auros, and then putting the initial implementation or the initial configuration in place so that we can grow into the ultimate or the long-term goal. It's a challenge that we face with our application engineers. We're getting much better at it. We're using the system. We've been using the system now to do our implementations for about 4 years. And the success that we have now and the mistakes that we made in the past, those have been reduced. The successes that we have increased. And we're now starting to get to a point where we can actually communicate these things across the people in our group, and we can ensure that it's consistently being applied from one project to the next. But that wouldn't have been possible if we had not done it in Auros. We tried to not do it in Auros for a long time, and then finally we convinced people in our organization that we sell this stuff, we should probably use it. And it's really, really had a lot of benefits that we've seen over the past 4 years approximately. We'll talk a little bit about that in a presentation tomorrow, but the challenge for us has always been, what are people trying to accomplish? What does that look like in Auros? And how do we get them from what they're doing now to what that looks like? And it's a phased approach. It's not something that happens overnight where you take that Excel file, you configure it over here, and people just use it. We've got to make sure that we configure the initial implementation in a way that we can grow into the long-term plan, because the buy-in's not going to happen if people aren't familiar, if they're not comfortable, and they don't believe that it's going to work. So I think that's everything from here. We went over the roadmap, talked about some common challenges, some of the best practices for how to mitigate those challenges, and hopefully we can show that these kinds of things are possible. We have a lot of organizations that are here right now that have accomplished these kinds of things. The enterprise capability is something that, depending on the size of your organization, is not, that doesn't happen overnight, but we have proof that it can happen, it can grow in organizations. It's the challenge on us to make sure that we do it in a way that people are going to buy in, and we still set us up, or we still set their implementation up to be able to grow into the functionality that we know is capable down the road. So does anyone have any questions about that? Something they expected to get out of this that they didn't? Yeah, I think Ryan will bring you a mic.
Do you have the capability, so you know, working with us, we're going to implement multiple processes, right? Mm-hmm. So do you have a way to track that in a flow chart style? So if you're in, we call ours P, so you're in P4, P10, like you start here, like if a customer or a user was going to go in and this is kind of how the data flows and we put it in numerical order or however we decide to do it. Is there a way, like a flow chart, that can work through that all the way to the end?
Yeah, so
you know what I mean?
The challenge, right, is that there's probably, all of our processes at organizations are complex, right? So there probably is a flow chart, but are the details that are necessary to execute the flow part of that flow chart? And the challenge with a document is that it's almost impossible to do, right? The flow chart's an image, and the information that goes with the flow chart is pages or indexes or appendixes or whatever, appendix at the end that go into that process. So we can demonstrate what that process is at the top level, but with Auros, we can actually deliver the information in. So we can start with the high level, so in your situation it's P10, but it might be like the project management process, right? That's the umbrella. They shepherd everything through product development and testing and manufacturing and engineering, all that stuff, right? So at that level, we can put the main steps in the process, and then as you get into the individual areas of, let's say, product design, within product design, there are multiple different steps within their individual process. They have outputs that then go into, right, the manufacturing side and all that stuff. So we can start to layer these knowledge packets similar to the way that we saw the chartering session and the things that go into it. So that wasn't a process within a process, but it could have been. And we can start to then step through those processes and understand that the information starts here. These are the specifics for it. It flows there. And as we start to tie together different assessments, and we communicate both horizontally and vertically, because we can go down, but then we can go across as well from one process to the next, then we can start to see those connections. So we'll start with like a seed project in one process, which is what we're doing with your organization now. And then as we start to do the adjacency developments, we'll do the other processes, and we can connect those two things together because they're in one system where the information can be communicated in a way that in a document it's very difficult to do, if not impossible.
Is there a best practice for how and when to communicate to upper management, and what level?
Yeah, so there is. And I would say the best practice So there are different ways to communicate to different levels within the organization. And this isn't completely true across everyone, because human nature means that some people are going to care about things that others don't. But what we found is that at an executive level, they're really concerned, or the value that they see is this aspirational goal, right? They see enterprise capability, adjacent developments, demand-driven growth, people not having to go into shared drives and not having to go into document repositories. That's what those people are really concerned with. So when we go into a meeting with upper management, we don't talk a whole lot about these are the buttons that you click when you fill the assessment control out. What we're talking about is conceptually, at your organization, if we start this thing small and we grow it, this is what can be accomplished. So we still have to have some details of how we can do that, which would be, if you're familiar with phase gates at your organization, those are things that we can communicate, right? Some of the failure points. But when we talk to executives, a lot of times we want to talk at more of an aspirational level or more of a conceptual level, because that's where the value comes from. So understanding what it is that the process struggles with today at a high level, and then understanding how we can communicate that the technology can solve those problems at a high level, is generally what we'll say we should be doing with executives. So the challenge there is understanding the process, right? And understanding at a high level what they're looking for. The other thing with executives is they want to know about reporting, right? Because if there are problems happening and if people aren't doing what they're supposed to do, they want to be able to know that. So I think you had two parts to your question, right? How do you do it? So that's the how. The when is trickier, right? So the when is tricky because we don't necessarily know whether the executive is going to want to see a demonstration. We don't necessarily know if they're going to want to talk to people in their group and get feedback from them that, yes, this is going to work, yet no, it's not. So the when oftentimes depends on the executive and understanding what it is that they're going to ask for to validate that the concept is real and that it's achievable. So some organizations have executives, or some executives want to know from their people, well, do you think this is going to work? So the when to present to those people would be after you've presented to the people that work for them and they've bought into that it's going to work. Other executives want to know, well, from a technology perspective, what does the roadmap look like? So the when is going to be after you understand what the roadmap is going to look like. The when is a trickier one, and it's much more difficult for us to put best practices around that because it's so dependent on the executive and what they're actually looking for. Does that answer your question? Any other questions? Salim, you look like you have a question. No, he doesn't. He just looks that way. Okay, so thank you guys. As always, if you have feedback, please open up your application. Give us that feedback. Again, we make a lot of changes at the conference based on feedback that people provide. So if it's positive, that's great. If it's negative, that's even better for next year. I guess it's not that great for this year, but if it's negative, we welcome the feedback, because a lot of the decisions that we make about how we do these things, what we do, is based on feedback that we've received from the guests.